Yes, I think that came through okay. Okay, yeah, so just by way of introduction, what I'll do quickly is to talk about the film which we've worked behind, the Eating Our Way to Extinction film, and an update on what's happening there. I'll talk about the work on planetary boundaries and how our food systems contribute to the environment. And then I'll talk about what the title is, the breaking news, which is a paper that's actually hasn't come out of peer review yet, but I think you'll find that very interesting. But so I'll launch into now, Eating Our Way to Extinction. It's had about 10 million views. It's now free on YouTube. Um, the, um, the documentary has been the voiceover was done beautifully by Kate Winslet in English. It's now been done in 18 different languages and released in different countries with celebrities also doing the voiceover in those languages. So some of them are, red carpet events. It's also been given quite a lot of celebrity endorsements, and that's a big part of it. It's received 12 awards so far, and the compendium, the information that goes with the documentary is a website containing lots of ideas, some of the science, and also cookbooks, kids cookbooks, and a science book that backs it up. And we've now edited the documentary down to a 36-minute summary version, and that also is available free on YouTube. So that's the update on Eating Our Way to Extinction. What I want to talk about now is how food systems impact the world and how we can actually reverse the damage that we've done to the environment through food. So before I do that, I want to introduce my background. Now, I worked for government for decades, mapping deforestation. Okay, my state, Queensland, is a pretty big chunk of the northeast section of Australia. There's a map of Texas within Queensland. Queensland's about 2.5 times bigger than Texas, so it's a pretty big home patch. We use satellite data and a lot of field work to monitor the tree clearing, the deforestation. And over that time, over the 30 years of satellite monitoring, we mapped 2,500 acres of trees being cut down per day, and 93% of that was for grass-fed industries, and most of it was virgin forest. There's some re-clearing, but 2,500 acres per day. So that's the equivalent of about two new suburbs that you might be aghast to see urban sprawl taking out forest. Well, that's two suburbs per day. That's just my corner of the world, 4% of the world's deforestation. And this is a video that I've thrown these things together, but it starts off in Australia, then goes to other countries. This method of tree clearing has been invented and perfected in Australia. You get two of the biggest bulldozers you can find, 50 to 100 ton dozers, D9, D11 dozers, and you string a chain between them. Now, one link of the chain is too big to lift. So this is massive industrial scale tree clearing, and it's so effective that it's now used globally. But these dozers, the noise of this is just stunning. Two of the biggest dozers you can imagine going flat out, dragging this chain, which is clanking. The trees are crashing and thumping and splitting and thumping on the ground. The wildlife is going mad. The birds, the shriek just goes straight through you. But for those trees, see that spike on the front of these dozers, for these trees that are too big to literally rip out of the ground, they use that spike to push them over. And this is in the United States. So this is globally what happens. This comes from Brazil. This is the Cerrado in Brazil, subtropical forest, not the big rainforest, and they're using the same methods. So this is a very effective method of clearing. This is one of the early shots. This is back in the 1950s when this method was first perfected in Australia. They used these tractor trawlers, and they had a big weight in the middle to lift the chain off the ground so that it had more push when it hit the trees, and it literally ripped the trees out of the ground. Then you push together the trees and you burn them. None of this. That's a drip torch, by the way. Now they use these drip torches from helicopter or quad bike, but these fires after deforestation are just relentless. A lot of airports have been closed in Southeast Asia due to these deforestation fires. And then they stick rake, they take away all of the remains of the forest, and they burn again and they burn again. Now, these are maps. This is very interesting. Most people don't see this because we live in cities where you don't see the burning, but I think we've had enough of that. So that brings us on to the first of the planetary boundaries, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the message with deforestation is this: logging alone does not kill a forest. Even clear felling, getting rid of every tree and pulling them out, and even burning it and live once is not enough to kill a forest. The forest will regrow. Repeated burning is required to kill a forest. And as we saw, the ripping the trees out of the ground, the stumps have got to be ripped out, the stick rakes, the trunks have got to be pushed together and burned again. So logging does not kill forest. Repeated burning kills forest. Oh, and going back there, this is a map of north and south of the equator, a 10-day composite of fires all around the world. And you can see that Africa is burning, South America is burning. So agriculture, just shift this a bit. We now know that agriculture causes between 88 and 99% of deforestation. This is from recent years, and most of the clearing has been, or deforestation has been, in the tropics. And we know that now, for we've got about 4 or 5 decades of satellite data, and we can work it out very carefully. But 96% of the world's deforestation is happening in the tropics now, in the rainforests and in the subtropics, and 88 to 99% of that is caused by agriculture. It won't click ahead. Oh, here we go. Yeah, something went strange there. So South America has been particularly well studied, and they found that 84% of the deforestation, not only in Brazil but surrounding countries, it's for cattle grazing and for animal feed crops. So if you wanted to put your finger on what causes deforestation, there it is. When we deforest, when we take away the forest, burn again and again, and then clear it and cultivate the ground, the habitat is gone, basically. So what happens to the wildlife that was on that habitat? Well, to wildlife, their patch is everything. That's why they're territorial, because their territory, their ecosystem is their life support, their food. So if you take that away, they can't just move to the adjoining patch of forest or grassland or whatever, savanna. They can't just move because there are other wildlife who live there. So you take away the ecosystem that supports their life and they die. Some of the birds may survive by eating some of the crops, but basically the wildlife goes. As soon as you take the habitat, the wildlife goes. And that's exactly how we're causing the sixth great extinction, because we have so trashed our planet, we've so destroyed the natural ecosystems on the planet that we've got rid of the wildlife. We'll get to that in a minute. So many of you have heard that if we all consume like North Americans, we would need 5 planets to sustain that consumption. And globally, overall, we need 1.7 planets to support global consumption. So what does that mean exactly? Is it iPhones? Is it caviar? What's causing the problem now? Well, we know. Well, let's define that exactly. And there's been an enormous amount of work done on planetary boundaries. What this is defining the systems that support life on Earth and seeing what they are and seeing how threatened they are. How are we doing against their limits? Are we overstepping the limits, or are we working within a safe operating space? And it's now been determined that there are 9 planetary boundaries, things like climate change, biosphere, deforestation, fresh water, pollution, ocean acidification, stratosphere, and air pollution. And we now know that 6 of those 9 have been exceeded. Now, by definition, if we exceed one planetary boundary, say just the biosphere, so that's biodiversity loss, species loss, if we exceed that limit, we endanger all life on Earth, any one of them. We endanger all life on Earth. And we've exceeded 6 of the 9, so we're not doing too well. This diagram is the same as the previous one, and it's a little earlier, so it doesn't have the 6 exceeded here. But this is a really interesting diagram because I want to draw your attention to the black spots within those footprints. And you see that the black spots take up most of those footprints, except for one, which is climate change, and we'll talk about that later. But those black dots refer to the impact that agriculture has on us, on how those planetary boundaries have been exceeded. So you can see that agriculture alone is the biggest driver of exceeding planetary boundaries. And we'll get to why. So we now know that global food production is the single largest driver of environmental degradation and transgression of planetary boundaries. And by the way, everything that I'm quoting here is from the literature, from the peer-reviewed literature and government reports. So it's not controversial. This is peer-reviewed, means that it's been scrutinised to a high level and it's been checked off. It's proven. So this is non-controversial. This is known as best as our systems, as our science knows. So what we do know now is that the current food system, the way we consume now, the current food system can feed half our current population sustainably. It can only feed half the number of people we have on the planet right now. So in other words, we're up against a brick wall here. This is crunch time. We can't continue. And the thesis of this talk is that diet change is essential for a habitable planet. It's no longer a matter of personal preference. I know that many of us believe that we should keep our preferences to ourselves and not dictate what others should or shouldn't do, including eat. But the fact is that if we continue eating the way we are, if we continue the food systems the way they are, we won't have a planet for our grandchildren. It's as simple as that. So Yes, we have a population problem. As David Attenborough said, we have overrun our Earth. Um, and the big problem with population is not humans, although there are 9 billion of them. The big population is the animals that we keep to eat, of which there are 90 billion each year. And the bulk of that, the bulk of the biomass, the weight of animals, is actually taken up by cattle for dairy and for beef. So this is a study. It's about a decade old, so it's not up to date. But these are the figures from a few years back. This is the weight of mammals on Earth. Okay, so that's the biomass. It's the weight of all the different types of mammals on Earth, from mice up to whales and elephants, cattle, etc. Humans make up a third of the biomass on Earth. Now that's enormous. That's true. But farmed animals make up 60%. Now, this is interesting because those farmed animals are mostly cattle. About a third of it is pigs, and a few sheep and down the bottom. But the bulk of it is cattle, right? So these animals are bred to grow as fast as they possibly can. Now, take pigs, for example. They normally live 15 to 20 years, but we breed them from birth to 100 kilograms, which is the slaughter weight. We breed them in 5 to 6 months, and they're bred that way so that they're ravenously hungry the whole time. They have to eat 5 times more than humans do. And of course, they put 5 times more than we do, but they have to eat that because they're scaringly hungry just to put on, they put on 1.7 kilos, 2 pounds a day. It's just, I feel for these poor animals, but the cattle are exactly the same. They've been bred to grow as fast as possible. And they make up, so what the point here is that they make up 60% of the biomass on Earth, but what they consume is a lot more than 60% of what all the other animals consume because they're young, they're babies, they're teenagers, and they're eating like as much as they can to grow because they're bred for that. So they consume more than 60% of the available feed on Earth. By the way, pets make up 1%. But what's left for wildlife? What do we have left for wildlife after all of that humans and our animals that we keep? 4%. Okay, so we've squeezed wild mammals into just 4% of the mammals on Earth. This is because most of it is taken up with the animals we keep for our food. So that is the reason why we are in the midst of the 6th great extinction. We've taken all the habitat, or a lot of it, of the wildlife. So we squeeze them into a corner. This is why outbreaks happen of diseases, because when you stress a wild animal, when you take away its habitat, its viral load goes through the roof. So any human contact, that viral load is more likely to jump. Okay, so let's talk about biodiversity loss. The experts say that we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction on Earth. Previous mass extinctions have been due to all sorts of things like meteors and so on, but this one is all of our doing. And these figures are also a few years old now, but 68% of the wildlife population, the numbers of wildlife, has gone. Half the plants are gone, half the fish are gone. But of the fish that we eat, the big fish that we eat, 80 to 90% of those are gone. So the experts, even in the science literature, which is notoriously conservative normally, you get these scientists saying things like humans are responsible, the 6th mass extinction is already here, and the window for effective action is very short. This is almost alarmist language, but it's in the science literature. So these guys are dead worried. What is the greatest driver of biodiversity loss? 80% of agricultural land is devoted to livestock and feed, and meat is the biggest threat to wildlife. So it's not feral cats. It's not plastic. It's meat. So these are the biodiversity loss hotspots globally. And you can see that, well, it's pretty much everywhere. Nutrient pollution. Now, this is considered the greatest environmental pollution on Earth. And what is it? It's the nitrogen and phosphorus that come from our food systems. And what we do is we have this Haber-Bosch process that pulls nitrogen out of thin air, basically. And the nitrogen that's in the air is non-reactive, but the nitrogen that we use for fertilizers is reactive. So this process that we developed for making explosives, we use it with great effect as a fertilizer. So the excess fertilizer enters the waterways, and it acidifies and it eutrophies. It strips the oxygen and it makes acid of fresh water. So, and it's considered the single greatest coastal water and air polluter. So in the US, as with other countries, meat production is the leading cause of nitrogen pollution in the USA. But there are now 300 to 400 ocean dead zones around the world from nitrogen pollution. The Gulf of Mexico is a classic, but this map shows that the red dots are the dead zones, permanent dead zones. And these occur mostly at the estuaries, offshore from the big rivers that deliver the big load of nitrogen and phosphorus. But the worrying thing about this, well, dead zones are worrying, obviously, but even more worrying is the blue in this map, and that is that the open oceans are starting to be depleted of oxygen. And so that we're losing oxygen in the open oceans, which, of course, if there's no oxygen, the fish can't live, the wildlife can't live. So hypoxic, that is water lacking in oxygen, hypoxic oceans are a driver in past mass extinctions. So where does that nitrogen come from? Well, nitrogen is fed to plants, which is then eaten by us partially. Most of it's eaten by animals. So if we eat chicken, which is the most efficient of protein converters, nitrogen, by the way, is almost the equivalent of protein. It's the first level test for protein is the nitrogen content. So that's why nitrogen fertilizers are so important to produce protein for us to eat. So of the nitrogen that's placed on the crops, if we eat chicken, which have eaten the crops, we waste 80%. And this is the most efficient of the converters. We waste 80%. So it's like lining up 5 bowls of pasta in front of you for dinner. And you eat one bowl and you throw out the other 4 bowls. That's the 80% that's wasted if we eat chicken. So this is where the wastage in the food system is. Beef is the most wasteful. 96% of the protein they ingest, or the nitrogen they ingest, is wasted. Pork, 85% is wasted. And there have been a lot of study, particularly in Europe, where you have different countries bordering rivers that are polluted. So you get this nitrogen runoff from all these pig factories, etc., and it pollutes the rivers. So one country complains to the originating country. So you have all these studies done, and Europe's the leader in nitrogen studies. And what they found is that the solution to reducing the nitrogen to a level where the natural systems can cope is a no-meat diet, is the most effective way to prevent the killing off the waterways, basically. Fresh water. This is a big concern. By 2030, we'll need 40% more water. That's just around the corner. We don't have enough water now. 84% of cropland will have less water due to climate change. And this perhaps is the most worrying point about water and about climate change, is that there's over 20 million climate refugees per year. And that's averaged since 2008. There was over 100 million last year. But let me tell you about how that happens. In developing countries, well, most of these 20 million refugees, by the way, are in the poorer nations, and they stay within their continent. So they're not refugees running to another continent. They flee where they can't grow food, and they flee to other regions within their country or to other countries bordering theirs. So Africa is the hotspot of these refugees. And that causes all sorts of social unrest and armed conflict in the end. But this is the face of climate change. Of course, the millennium drought in Iraq, in Syria, resulted in 5 million people, refugees, and some of them tried to go into Europe. And the problems that presented were enormous. They were global problems. So that's I think it's not sea level rise is not going to happen in our lifetimes as much as that. The big problem is the refugees. That's the critical climate thing. And where does the water go? Well, it takes 6 times more water to grow a kilo of protein or a pound of protein from animal sources than it does from plant sources. And it takes 20 times more water to grow calories from beef than from grain or potato. So six times more water for protein, 20 times more water for calories. The oceans. Overfishing has wiped out 90% of the fish that we eat. Bottom trawling has ploughed the continental shelves. We've destroyed the ecosystems on much of our continental shelves by bottom trawling, which it's unseen. So this is why they've discovered that half the plastics in the ocean are actually discarded fishing gear or nets that have been ripped up and lost because they hit something hard. We've been bottom trawling and ripping up nets and discarding them for a long time now. Now, this is a really interesting study. The Global Ocean Commission was set up some years ago to report on how we are traveling with fishing. How are the fish surviving? What are the stocks doing? What is sustainable fishing? And they found that since the 1950s, the fishing capacity has gone up 63%. It's gone up more now. This is 2016 we're talking. So the fishing capacity has gone up 63%, but the amount of fish to fish has gone down by 87%. So these guys, the Global Ocean Commission, released this report, and it was frowned upon, so the Global Ocean Commission was shut down. But these figures, thankfully, are still out there. So the fishing fleet since the 1950s has gone up actually 10 times, but the catch has gone down 5 times. So, and we're still subsidising this, which is crazy. Climate, I don't want to dwell on this, but there are many tipping points that we are now hitting. And food systems within climate will cause dangerous global warming, even if we tomorrow shut down all fossil fuels. If we stop burning all fossil fuels tomorrow, food systems alone will drive us into dangerous global warming. And what is the highest impact solution to climate change? Well, we've got some proposed geoengineering and proposed systems that can pull carbon dioxide out of air, but they're ridiculously inefficient. The most efficient of all is the tree. Isn't that marvelous? And you'll find that reforestation or afforestation is the leading solution to climate change in all of those serious studies that look at what can we do about climate. The most effective thing we can do is grow trees. And if we rewild pastures, just pastures alone, we draw down enough decades of emissions. And of course, if we had less ruminants on those pastures, less if we had less red meat and dairy along with that, the methane would also contribute a lot. The reduction in methane would contribute a lot to slowing down global warming. But what do we need to do to rewild those areas? Well, we now use two things to suppress nature bouncing back, to suppress the growth of forests, and they're equally effective. The first one is fire, and we burn the world, as you saw, and they're deforestation fires, but they're also pasture maintenance fires. And we've been doing that for a long time. Even Indigenous people have been doing that. And it's done to kill the dead grass, which is in the wet season, it grows long. In the dry season, it's dead and unpalatable. So we burn that off to create green pick for the next season. But we also kill the ticks as we're doing that, which is good for grazing cattle. So we burn the dead grass and we burn with it any seedlings that have popped their heads up. So we stop the forest from coming back by burning. So that's a very effective method. The other incredibly effective method of stopping forests from coming back is ruminants, sheep and goats in particular, and cattle as well. But if you've ever seen any photos of the Scottish Highlands, you'll see that there's no trees. And what happens is that if a tree seedling pops its head up, bang, it's gone. The sheep just love that stuff. So the trees haven't got a hope. There are some reforestation programs, but the very word, the name of Scotland used to be Caledonia, which means forest. So that whole moonscape that is there now used to be forest. So sheep particularly have been the terra formos in that case. So, and we know that the lowest cost and the largest scale and the most natural fix for climate change is rewilding. And it's been equated to a diet. If we go to a low meat diet, this is the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. If we go to a low meat diet, it's half the cost of any other mitigation measure. If we go to the vegan diet, it's 20% of the cost of any other mitigation measure. And this is why the vegan diet reduces land use by an area the size of Africa. And nature is ready and willing to bounce back. This here is Victoria, where there's been clear felling deforestation. So everything's been taken out and it's actually burned with drip torch from a helicopter and left alone. And this is how it comes back. So if we can seriously think about how we use our planet, and the greatest land use on the planet by far is grazing land. That takes up 37% of the planet. And next comes crops, which is 12% of the planet, of which half go to feeding animals. So over 40% of the land area, the ice-free land area of planet Earth, is devoted to growing animals. So if we rewild some of that land, just the grazing land, it'll solve the biodiversity crisis, solve the climate crisis, solve the deforestation crisis, fix the water cycles, and go a long way towards nutrient pollution reversing. But the problem is this requires diet change. So what is the diet change? Okay, well, there's been a number of reports. This is just one, but it's what the WWF did a few years back, and they looked at meat consumption, and they said that globally, meat consumption must fall by 3/4 to be sustainable, so that we have a sustainable food system to support future generations. It must fall by 3/4. And of course, that's globally. So in Western countries like Australia, like in North America, where we have the Western diet, the meat consumption in those countries must reduce by over 90%. So that's the sustainable level. It's more than 90%. And we've actually attributed to each of these. So for climate, for biodiversity loss, water security, deforestation, nitrogen, zoonotic disease, oceans health, and human health, we've discovered, or we've estimated what needs to reduce for each of those. For example, for water security, we must replace 75% of meat with plant proteins, just to have sustainable water for the planet. And as Jonathan Foley, who's the head of the Project Drawdown, as Jonathan Foley says, things happen very, very, very slowly and then all at once. So that's my hope as well. So what I want to touch on before I get to the breaking news is some of the myths that surround animal agriculture these days. Regenerative ranching is probably the biggest of all, scam of all. It's remarkably good advertising. It's incredible marketing, but unfortunately, it does not do what it says on the packet. Regenerative ranching is not going to save the climate. That Alan Savory talk from 2013 was hugely influential, and it's got such a following now that even governments are supporting these ideas. But the problem is it just doesn't work. Other documentaries like Soil Carbon Cowboys and even Kiss the Ground have supported it. So they've got the public behind them. But the bottom line is, if we restore all of the world's grazing soils, okay, they're saying that soil carbon, replenishing the soil carbon will solve the climate. Okay, if we do that, if we restore all the degraded soils, in this bar chart, the blue area is the amount of carbon that will store. Surprisingly little. If we restore the carbon of all the world's crops, okay, so this is grazing soils, if this is the world's croplands, if we restore those soils, we can draw down a lot more carbon. And this is interesting because we turn over the soil in croplands, and because of that, we break up the structure, we break up the living things in the soil. We also expose it to the air, and a lot of the carbon is lost. So there's a lot more carbon lost out of crop soils than there is out of grazing soils. But if we restore the forests that used to be the former forests on grazing lands, this here is that amount. So the restoration potential in the above ground carbon is way, way more. The soil carbon is only a few percent of what the above ground carbon would be if we restored the forest that used to be on grazing lands. And for interest, I've also got here a bar of showing what would happen if we restored forest on all of the built up areas in the world, all of the cities, all of the transport, all of the mines, all of the roads and bridges. If we restored the carbon, restored the forests on those lands, this would be the potential here. So that's the above ground carbon. So cities and mines and all of the built up areas, they take just 1% of the land, whereas grazing lands take 37% of the land. So we are squandering, perhaps is what our most valuable asset is. What do we value in life? Family comes first. Land, I would say, is second. And we squander 37% of our land for growing grass-fed animals, from which we get 14% of our protein. In fact, if you look at the animals that are exclusively grass-fed, which is what some people advocate we should do, we should only eat grass-fed animals. The animals that are exclusively grass-fed now, they account for just 1% of our protein intake. So for very little food, we are squandering 37%, the biggest chunk of our land by far. And I did a little bit of work on regenerative grazing a little while back, and there is some evidence produced that supports the thesis that regenerative grazing can restore soil carbon. And if you look at this evidence closely, you'll find three factors that are commonly used to make it look good. And I've called these the regenerative grazing bluffer's guide to soil carbon. And the first thing they do is import nutrients. Like, for example, White Oaks Farm, where this picture is, they import grain, they feed it to chickens. The chickens poop on the ground, and that stimulates growth of the grass, and the cattle eat the grass. Now, because you have grass growth, you also have roots growth, and you have stimulated soil carbon in the soil. So they can show on White Oaks Farm that the soil carbon is increasing, definitely. But where's that soil carbon coming from? It's coming from the grain that they fed to the chickens that pooped on the soil, and so you're importing carbon. Now, how sustainable is that? This system relies on grain grown elsewhere. So that's the first thing they use. The second thing they use is a stocking rate. And there was a study done in Australia on how profitable regenerative grazing was compared to conventional grazing. And they did this over hundreds of different properties. And they found that regenerative grazing produced only half the profit of conventional grazing. And the reason was because they had half the cattle. Now, it's easy to make the grass grow to increase the soil. Okay, grass grows and it has roots, and that feeds the soil, so you get carbon into the soil. The carbon comes from photosynthesis in the leaves, nowhere else. It comes from the leaves and it ends up in the soil. But you've got to have things growing to introduce that to the soil. So the carbon is increasing if you have greater grass growth. So if you take off half the cattle, you will have greater grass growth. So this is number two. This is how to increase the soil carbon. Number three is commonly done, and many of the studies that support regenerative grazing use this trick. And that is, if you take cropland, which is, as we saw before, it's depleted of carbon, a lot of the carbon has been lost. If you take that to be grassland, growing anything that perennially, rather than ripping it out each year, if you grow grass that stays there, you will increase the soil carbon, no question. So these are the three things that you should look for if you're evaluating a study that supposedly supports regenerative grazing claims. Look for these three things. That's the bluffer's guide. Okay, another myth is that, there used to be more bison on the plains than there are now. Well, we have 7 times the biomass of farmed animals, more biomass in the farmed animals than we had 10,000 years ago. Okay, so most of them are cattle. So the the grazing pressure is from a few million bison is nothing like the grazing pressure from hundreds of million. In fact, there's over 1.5 billion cattle on Earth now. And you can see this. This is outlined in red. This is how much biomass, that is the weight of wild animals in 10,000 years ago. And this is the biomass or weight of farmed animals now. And another argument is that it's a natural cycle. Well, as you saw from the numbers of cattle that we have on planet Earth now is way beyond anything that's natural. And this gives you an idea of how much methane each of these animals, including humans, produces. So cattle are by far the biggest. They have these multiple stomachs, and they need bacterial activity on the cellulose and other fibers that they eat to break that down so that they can use that. And part of that produces methane, which is then enters the bloodstream, which is then burped out. Another myth is that livestock, farmed animals are needed in developing countries as wealth and as food security. And this is proving exactly the wrong way to go in Africa. For over a decade now, they've had such extreme droughts that, 2 decades, I should say, they've had such extreme droughts that they've lost all of their wealth. And the Kenyan government has assisted. The last report I read had 5,000 traditional herders were taken by the Kenyan government, and they were given land, and they were taught how to grow crops sustainably with limited water, and even cash crops like aloe vera. They're cash crops, and they've also got subsistence crops. So food security and wealth, both those arguments are out the window now. And manure for fertility, this is perhaps one of the most muddle-headed ideas out there. As I said, fertility, the nitrogen that we use for producing crops is the worst polluter of water globally. And we're talking about taking that nitrogen and taking that waste from animals and putting it on farms. It's toxic for a start. It's full of chemicals and hormones, but it's also got the pathogens. It's full of pathogens. In fact, what happens now, I did a study recently as a piggery, not in a few hundred k's away. And it was a medium-sized, biggest in Australia, but it's probably a medium-sized piggery globally, 140,000 pigs. Now, because pigs eat 5 times what we do and poop 5 times what we do, they produce 5 times more waste. And so you can equate 140,000 pigs to a city of about 750,000 people. So you can probably think of a city near you of 750,000 people. Now, if we had the waste, if we had the sewerage from that city being pumped out into open ponds, open to the atmosphere, there'd be a public uproar about that. But that's what's done for every piggery. They pump it into open ponds. And what happens is when it rains, it gets these ponds leak and they overflow, and this gets into the groundwater, gets into the watercourses and pollutes. So that's the reason why when you have a flood, authorities say do not enter floodwaters. They hold too many pathogens. That's where the pathogens come from. So let's talk about waste. Farmed animals use 43% of the land, but they give us 12% of our food by dry weight. Food crops use 6% of the land, actually a bit less for food, and they give us 85% of our food. And there's a few percent of seafood over here as well. But isn't that strange? 6% of the land, or actually a bit less, can give us 85% of the land, but the remaining 15% comes from all the oceans and the other 43% of the land. So how wasteful is that? It's also an interesting mental exercise to think about, well, how close are we to getting to a sustainable level? If we're talking that sustainable level is a 90% reduction in meat, that means that 85% of our food right now is plant-based, 85%. So all we need to do is take something like 12 or 13% of the of the 100%, but another 12 or 13% of food and just a few percent of animal products. And we're there. We've got sustainability. So we're very close. We're 85% already. Okay, now I want to talk about a new paper which is in peer review at the moment. So this is not, it's not, if you like, scrutinized. It's not fact checked, if you like. This is a paper we're working on, and it's talking about the how we measure the emissions from animal agriculture. So this is not beyond dispute, and people may argue this. Everything that I've said up until now is peer reviewed. This is new stuff. So we proposed a new accounting system, and I won't get into it altogether, but this is the big part of it. The big part of carbon accounting, emissions accounting right now is this. When we burn fossil fuels, we produce carbon dioxide, and under IPCC guidelines, under their standards, we count 100% of that emission. So all of the fossil fuel emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, are counted. When we destroy a forest for agriculture or whatever, we report only 28% or less than a third of those emissions. And the reason for that is that, and this is the argument, they argue that, okay, but of the emissions that if we burn rainforest here, there are other trees over here that are growing, that are soaking up some of that carbon dioxide. Therefore, what's left in the atmosphere is the thing that will affect the climate. Therefore, we should only count what affects the climate, right? Okay, that's reasonable logic to most people, but the trouble is it's inconsistent. The thing with emissions from carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels is this. They also, most of the carbon dioxide is drawn down by growing vegetation, most of it, more than half. So nature treats emissions exactly the same way. The growing trees don't discriminate between fossil fuels or deforestation, carbon dioxide. They soak it all down. But we account for it quite differently. So this is the argument we're saying that this is an inconsistency, and what happens if we make this consistent? It's staggering the difference it makes. Sorry for the graphs. I hate to bore you with these sort of things, but on the left-hand side, this is the IPCC accounting standards. Now, if you look at the wedge of orange, that wedge is the amount of fossil fuels that we have released. And this is since 1750. So most of them have come from the 1800s. And this is, in orange is the amount that we've released. Now, most of that has been absorbed by vegetation. That's what I said. But this is how we've counted in green. This is how we count the emissions from deforestation and other land emissions, such as burning peat. If we drain peat and burn it, or even without burning it, it releases carbon dioxide. And we do that to create grazing lands. So all the human activities that release land carbon dioxide, including deforestation and peat. This green part here is what they are now currently calculating for that. Okay, but if you look on the right-hand side, if you account for these consistently, you count 100% of the fossil fuel emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and 100% of the deforestation emissions, this is what you get. The orange stays exactly the same, but the green increases dramatically. In fact, you find this is a cumulative chart, right? So you find that at the present day, deforestation since 1750 has released more than double carbon dioxide of fossil fuels. So let me say that again. If you talk to anyone in the street and you say, what's causing global warming? They'll say carbon dioxide and fossil fuels. What we're proving here is that deforestation and other land emissions have caused more than twice the amount of carbon dioxide than fossil fuels. So this is a game changer. This means that any industry that uses a lot of land that used to be forest is responsible for huge emissions. And so deforestation has released twice as much more CO2 than fossil fuels. So industries that on former forest land have the greatest CO2 impact. So the other things that we do, I won't go into it, but I'll mention one thing. And this chart is a little bit cluttered, but I'll try to explain a couple of things here. What we've done is instead of comparing, say, methane and carbon dioxide with a metric, the commonly used metrics are global warming potential. Now, you might have heard of that, and you also might have heard of the arguments about global warming potential, because there's been a lot of them. Everyone's arguing about how to compare methane, how to compare it to carbon dioxide. But there's a way of avoiding that argument, and that is by looking at the effective radiative forcing. That is to see how much global warming has been produced by each of these gases. And that's been quantified now. And this chart shows that in the categories, in our new categories. So on the left-hand side, this multicolored bar shows it's got 0 in the middle, right? So the effective radiative forcing of the grey is carbon dioxide, and then there's methane, and then there's all the other climate pollutants. So that's the warming caused by fossil fuels since 1750. And below it is this may come as a surprise, but when you burn fossil fuels, you release warming gases, you also release cooling emissions. And these aerosols, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, have caused an enormous amount of cooling. So this bar below the line is cooling, above the line is heating. So when you take one from the other, when you subtract the cooling from the heating, you find that up to now, fossil fuels have caused less than 20% of global warming. And animal agriculture has caused half global warming. So this is this is why I call it breaking news, because if it's accepted, it's going to be a bit of a bombshell. So this is my result. The animal agriculture has caused half global warming. And yeah, okay. And methane alone, I haven't mentioned that, but methane alone has caused half global warming. Methane comes from animal agriculture as well as fossil fuels, coal mines and fracking and so on. So we can now look at the other impact of animal agriculture, and that is that the land that's now used for animal agriculture, how else could we use that land? Is it costing us, in terms of climate, to leave that land as grazing land, or could we return it to forest, the parts that were forest? And that proves to be a major possibility for the future. The size of these bubbles in this chart are the carbon opportunity costs. So grazing land has the biggest bubble, the biggest carbon opportunity cost. Now, the other big bubble is from a study done a decade ago, which showed that degraded and other land could be rewilded, revegetated, and it also has a big bubble. But there's some overlap. Okay, this degraded land is also could be part of the grazing land. The other biggish bubble is cropland. Forestry is also there, but fossil fuels has a tiny bubble because we can't stuff coal back in the ground. We can regrow trees and draw down carbon, but we can't take back the carbon that we've burned. The other point I wanted to make here before finishing this is that without livestock to feed, we would have a 50% surplus of food. In other words, we could easily feed the population that's still coming in the next decades. And so the motto of this talk is eat plants and plant trees, as my daughter-in-law had embroidered on a shirt that I'm now wearing. So that's the end of this presentation. And now I think we can go to questions.
Thank you so much, Gerald, for all that incredible information. It's in a lot of the talks that we've had thus far, they've been very much on health and what individuals are doing to themselves. I feel it's even scary to see what we're doing to the planet. So it's definitely a very powerful, presentation. So how would people get in touch with you if they want to follow your work or reach out to you?
Okay. Well, I can put that in the chat actually. But if the contacts on Eating Our Way to Extinction, any of those contacts will lead to me eventually if my name is mentioned. But I'll pull. Where is the chat? Here we go. I'll put up the. So that's my email there. So yes, and any of the contacts on Eating Our Way to Extinction. Eating Our Way to Extinction, of course, is available free over on YouTube now, both the new short version and the original full version. And it's available in all those other languages as well. So we're getting the message out.
Great, thank you for that information. So let's go ahead. So for anybody who wants to ask questions of Gerald, you can raise your hand in Zoom, and the instructions are in the chat if you're not familiar with how to do that. So, there's a lot of, that obviously there's a political nature to this as far as when people hear about, environmental concerns, and it's become obviously quite controversial. Yeah, I think people experience it in their everyday, but yet it has become quite a hot button type of issue. You have people like Schwab who basically looks at this stuff and then says, oh, here's a bunch of solutions, and the solutions seem to be good for corporations and bad for people, and they don't necessarily address the underlying issues that they're supposed to address. How is what you're talking about differ from that type of perspective?
Yeah, okay. There's a bit to tease out here, but if you look at climate change is now accelerating. James Hansen produced a paper last year that said that as the world is cleaning up these the cooling pollutants that are sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. Actually, you might know that it's been called global dimming. And if you go to a big industrial city, particularly in Asia, you see it as a grey smog or a white smog that just hangs over everything. This is very polluting. It's very hard on your lungs, and your health, but it's also cooling, very cooling. And Europe's done an awful lot to clean up emissions, so their skies are clearing. Asia is also doing a lot, and we're clearing up shipping, which used to be incredibly dirty. And so all of these cooling efforts are resulting in all of these cleaning efforts are resulting in that cooling dissipating. So the cooling's going, but the warming is not. It's going to accelerate. It is accelerating right now. So we know the impact of food systems now is also huge, but everything is necessary now. Everything is necessary. And when we come back to the politics, okay, this is really interesting. I remember Barack Obama, when he was, well, not long after he was elected, he was criticized for not pursuing some of his promises. And he said to the activist, he said, make me do this. In other words, politicians cannot act without the populace being behind them. So we can't hide behind political views. We can't hide behind, oh, we've got a government that's not doing enough. And what I'm talking about is extremely empowering. Each one of us can, in fact, make a huge difference. The biggest difference that anyone and any group can do for the climate, for biodiversity, and all these other things is change their diet. That has a profound effect on many things. So that's really empowering. So it's like, it's not waiting for the coal-fired powerhouses to be shut down. It's not waiting for the government to stop giving you oil leases. It's something I can do right now, and no one can stop me doing that. Of course, we need to get rid of the subsidies. We need to get rid of we need to make the producer pays. In fact, it's really interesting. There was a study done. There's a group in Europe called TEEB, the Economics of Environmental and Biosystems, and they are trying to put a dollar value on nature. And they did a study a few years back that looked at industries, and one of the industries they looked at was cattle, dairy and beef. And they looked at, they had one grouping which was Australia and New Zealand, and they found that the external costs, the costs that are not paid by the industry, are 7 times greater than the industry revenue. In other words, the costs that no one pays, the cost to the climate, the cost to the water cycles, the cost to the biodiversity, the cost to water pollution, air pollution, etc. That cost, if that were factored in to beef, the price of beef would go up 7 times. So if that's necessary, I'm just running through the list of what's necessary.
Sure.
We need personal action. We need group action. We need politicians, but they're not going to do a thing until we do it. And we need to put a proper price on what these industries are costing us. They're costing us the earth. When we saw that graph before of overshoot, okay, we've overshot the earth's sustainable resources. That means that we're eating into credit. We're spending on our credit card way more than we have available. So that's affecting our future. We've got to pay that off at some time, at some point. So this is exactly what we're doing. We are squandering those natural, what they're putting a dollar on, the natural systems that no one is paying for at the moment. We must pay for them. So if the price of beef goes up 7 times, we can pay for them. So that's the sort of thing. But it's also the subsidies and industries. It seems that the most polluting industries on earth have the biggest presence in lobbying. So we need to shut them down a little as well.
So, okay, so first of all, a lot of this stuff isn't in the mainstream, right? And I can imagine why we don't really need to discuss why it's not in the mainstream per se. But what are the symptoms that people can see in their everyday life that is the impact of our choices, and more specifically in the larger industrial countries? You were mentioning water affecting people around the world, and but those are people that can kind of be tucked away, not talked about. But in the United States, if it happened in New York City, which I live an hour away from, and it was happening in a meaningful way, it may get a little bit more it'll get a little bit more buzz. Are there symptoms that people are seeing in their everyday life?
Yeah, exactly. There's an example that I use um, near where I live. There's a town called Lismore. It's it's um, it's got smashed in 2022. The whole city town almost wiped out. They have a brilliant MP. She's been on the job. She's doing a great job. And she said last year, she was being interviewed, and she said that if these are 1 in 100 year flood events, then I must be 500 years old. So, in other words, the old measures of what we used to consider normal are no longer normal. I mean, more and more of us are being affected. I think we are going to start listening. We are going to start realizing that we must do something for our kids and their kids want a habitable planet. But more of us are being affected. There's still people homeless living in their cars near me because they lost their homes through floods or fires. So it's affecting, as I said, 20 million refugees per year. That's going to affect more. It's going to affect global security. It's going to affect all of us. I mean, we might waltz into a supermarket and we can pretty much buy anything we please. But what effect is that having? I saw a study done last year, which was rather interesting, that said that if we can source deforestation-free beef from the Amazon, that's going to cut the deforestation in the Amazon by 50%. So the JBSs of the world, the world's biggest beef producer, they have very murky supply chains. And if we can get them, hold them to account and stop them from buying beef from producers who are causing the deforestation, that's going to stop half of the deforestation just by buying deforestation free beef. That's powerful. The spending power has enormous consequences. But so that's okay. So I won't go on. I see a lot of hands raised. So
Okay, I just have a few other questions as well. So we had a speaker on yesterday who was the author of a book called Clean Meat, and the idea was cultivated meat grown in a lab without animals. Would something like that, forgetting the health implications of eating that, would something like that have a positive impact on the environment, or are there hidden costs to even that kind of production of meat?
from what I've seen, which is limited, the the um, the meat substitutes are a brilliant idea, and if people were to switch for them from animal foods, the environment would benefit enormously. Um, I haven't seen that cultivated meat has done anything on a commercial scale yet. Um, so, there's few hurdles there still, I believe, but it's receiving such little funding compared with, say, subsidies to beef production. If it were to receive decent funding, we might get somewhere. But yes, I think they're really good ideas. But also, I think that um, the indigenous people of the world have a lot to teach us, and by that I mean the protein foods that are commonly eaten by indigenous people are almost disregarded. I mean, all of the pulses, all of the those vegetables that are also considered protein and vegetable foods heritage foods that have a huge nutrition value that are being almost disregarded. So we need to get some, and we do have some innovative chefs working on. I think if they worked on indigenous cuisine, we could go a long way with that. But I also think there is a place for cultivated and other, meat substitutes. Yes. And they definitely don't have the same environmental impact. No.
what are pulses? What would be an example of that?
Beans, lentils, peas. These foods are high protein. This is why soybeans. This is why the biggest thing that's fed to any feedlot animal is soybeans, and the reason for that is it's brilliant for nutrition. It's the highest nutrition, highest protein product out there. But there are many other beans and peas and pulses and lentils and all of those things. Indians have a big tradition with pulses, and legumes, I think, is another word for them.
Thank you.
But
And
but look, that's. I'm not a nutritionist, but I'm just commenting on the environmental impact.
no,
So
that's great. And I what I enjoy doing in this conference is getting information from one speaker and being able to ask other speakers about it. So I can run everything past nutritional experts. So but I appreciate where your expertise is in. So what specific challenges did you face in conveying the complex relationship between dietary choices and planetary health in the documentary to the general public?
well, the fact that the meat and dairy industries have been so effective in lobbying governments for support in getting milk into schools, for example, and subsidies so that these industries continue, and getting them embedded in nutrition guidelines, etc. That's been incredibly effective, even though it's led to the Western diet, of course, which is totally unhealthful. But that's been incredibly effective. So we're up against that, and the fact that they advertise, and if you look at the advertising on any platform, you'll find that about half of it is food, and most of that is the foods that make them a lot of money, which is the junk foods. So in the face of that advertising, it's very hard to convince your 2-year-old to eat their peas, for example. So all of those things must change. But some people seeing the documentary Eating Our Way to Extinction, that's the first they've heard, which is to me alarming. because this information's been out there for a long time. But the information is getting through. The last IPCC conference, they actually had a section a day on food systems. And now it's in the documents, and it's recognised that food systems must be addressed if we're going to address climate change. In fact, it's the major part of climate change, if my work is correct.
So what signs do you see that this information is getting more and more out into the public sphere? I think a lot of people are completely unaware of this aspect of the environmental impact of their food when they tend to think of challenges to the environment in the form of climate change or any other aspect. Animal agriculture is almost invisible, I think, in the mainstream mind. So what are you seeing that gives you hope that this is changing?
Yeah, well, the beef consumption in the US has been trending down for a few years. There's lots of reports out there. Actually, the last interesting one that I saw was only a couple of weeks ago, and it had a figure on German consumption, and the figure was just over 50%. It might have been 60% even, but a large proportion of Germans don't eat meat every day. In some Western countries, you expect to eat meat every day, but in Germany now, most of the population don't. So, and the numbers are growing. You know, we're coming off a very small base of the numbers of vegan and vegetarian, but I believe the growth rate is quite something, and that's getting through a lot to the younger generations who are more open to change. People of my age, the oldies, we're pretty much set in our ways, even though I'm vegan now, because I know the harms that are done. And whenever I get to cook, which is most nights, those who are here don't complain. And you know, that filters through. But yeah, it's definitely getting through. And you might think that, like Jonathan Foley says, you know, it happens very, very, very slowly and then all at once. I think that's going to happen. I think that we will hit a brick wall. More of us will be living in our cars. More of us will have lost their homes. More of us will have died from heat exhaustion. More of us will have lost a loved one from a flood. You know, and that's the face. It's the extreme weather now that's going to get us. You know, last year was an incredibly hot year. Whether it's an outlier or not, we don't know, but the trend is definitely up in that direction. And there's all these tipping points that have been had. There's Bangladesh is a classic example. It's a country that lives on a floodplain, largely. They have a lot of industry, they have a lot of people, and they have a lot of industries, but they're very, very affected by water feeding their agriculture. And because the floodwaters haven't been as consistent from the ice melt and snow melt, they now get floods and they get droughts. And I saw a photo recently of the border between India and Bangladesh, and that border has armed patrols on the Indian side, armed patrols manning a huge man-proof razor wire topped fence, because the Indians know that when the next drought hits, which is just a matter of time, when the next drought hits, if there's a way for the Bangladeshis to swap borders to walk onto Indian soil, they will, because that's natural. What would you do if you can't feed the family? You have to get, you know, lift up stumps and move. So this is the problem. This is the pressure that we're going to face. More and more of us will be faced with it either personally or someone we know and it's becoming more people that we know. But it's going to be more extreme. The next cyclone that comes through is we might lose our roof. It's a little inconvenience, but it's part of the new normal. If this is a 1 in 100 year event, then I must be 500 years old. These numbers don't mean anything anymore. They're talking about 1 in 1,000 year events. What does that even mean? It means that it's out of our control anymore. It's extreme, and we can't stop it except by rewilding a bunch of land. Where do we find that land? Grazing land.
So,
Yeah,
and that obviously sounds like is the root of your optimism that there are viable solutions that people in their
yeah,
individual choices can help influence. So now, speaking of the
absolutely.
individual choices, you mentioned people replacing meat, right? Like in Germany, they're eating less meat. What are they replacing it with? Are they, because a lot of times people go from red meat to fish or chicken, or you go from eating animal products in the form of meat flesh to being a vegetarian, but you're eating tons of dairy. What are you seeing, which have very similar footprints on it? What are you seeing meat be replaced with?
You're dead right. 30 years ago, when I stopped eating meat, I thought to myself, well, what do you eat if you don't eat meat? And that's a real concern for a lot of people. But I would aim them towards all of the help that's out there. There's a lot, and also the Eating Our Way to Extinction website has transition guides. It has food guides. It has nutrition information. It has cookbooks, and it has how-tos. And there are campaigns in many countries where people can mentor you through this process. But I would suggest that people look at indigenous foods. For example, Central American foods high on beans, corn. These are foods that are highly nutritious, um, and they've sustained those populations for a long time in great health. So, that's where we should look. We look at the blue zones, for example, around the world, where people live over 100 and productively, and we find that they eat very little meat, a lot of fruit and vegetables, um, and very and indigenous foods that they've eaten for a long time, and they don't need a lot of meat to survive. But I sympathize. It is a big transition for a lot of people, but there is help out there, definitely.
And so I'm actually talking to someone in the background, and she's talking about baby steps, right? Because she enjoys meat. And so what do you see as the baby steps that people can take that it makes it more accessible to them? Because obviously the idea of going from eating the standard American diet, tons of processed food, tons of animal products, to going plant-based is not realistic for most people, not only because it scares them, but they don't even know how to do it. So what do you see as accessible baby steps that people can take today that would make this more likely to happen?
Mm. Um, yeah, baby steps. Well, um, children these days are pretty picky eaters. At present, it's school holidays, and we have three of our grandchildren staying with us, from 5 up until 13. And tonight we had nachos made of beans, not beef. So, yeah, beans are incredibly nutritious, but they're
Mhm.
also pretty darn tasty when you do it the Mexican way. But the other things you can substitute, as well, like a lot of Italian food, for example. There's a lot of uh, uh, you know so many different vegetables cooked in so many different ways. I remember when I went to Italy 10 years ago, um, the most delicious meal I had was sitting in this old medieval village overlooking and we were eating a local pasta made with locally grown mushrooms, and it was absolutely delicious. So yeah, I see in the comments mushrooms. It can be turned into amazing steak, barbecue ports, or carnitas, whatever that is. Yeah, so I look to the indigenous foods for that. A lot of Asian foods, tofu, of course, it's a fermented food. And just north of us here, Indonesia, on the most populous island in the world, Java, you've got 100 million people, and one of their most popular things that they eat is tempeh, which is almost like it's whole beans fermented, whole soybeans fermented. Tofu is one of the most nutritious things. Soy curls, someone says. Yeah, so those sort of foods, fermented foods, are really good for our guts, of course, and tofu we eat a lot.
So we have some audience.
Fruit and veggies, they're the big ones.
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely. So we've got some audience members who have some questions. So I'm going to open up to the audience. Dominique, if you can unmute yourself, Dominic V, and then state your name, or sorry, state your name, where you're from, and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Dominique. I'm from Canada. And of course, Canada is a very cold country, and we are not seeing a lot of effects right now. So people are kind of secure in their thinking that we are protected against climate crisis. The thing is that really bothering me, and I'm pretty anxious about, is the food security, because as vegans we eat a lot of fruit, vegetables, and everything. But I heard, and maybe I'm wrong, but I heard that after beyond 39 degrees Celsius, the pollinizers are no longer effective. And as we know, we have our food system, is based on 85% of pollinized food. So I'm wondering, do you know, first of all, is that true after 39 degrees? And what about our food security with climate crisis? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. When we find that the supermarket doesn't carry everything we want, by the way, it's not us, it's not the wealthy nations that will suffer so much with climate change, it's the poor nations. They're the ones who, if we have a disaster situation where there's limited food, who's going to get that food? It's the ones with the money. So the wealthy nations will be served first, sadly. And as we've seen, climate change is affecting the poor nations. They're the bulk of the refugees. So yes, climate change is going to affect crops. One thing it does do, the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere stimulates plant growth. So the plants will grow faster under a high carbon dioxide atmosphere. However, the way we've been fertilizing and the way we've treated our soils, the plants are getting less nutritious. They've got fewer of the trace vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients and so on. So they grow bigger, but they're maybe not as nutritious. Also, the areas that we can farm are changing. There's some shock horror stories about, oh no, we can't grow grapes in this region anymore. We can't make wine because it's too hot. Some of those, that's common. And we may have to go back to heritage foods that can tolerate all sorts of different environments. I mean, Australian Aborigines were living in the hottest continent, which is a land of droughts and flooding rains, and they were doing fine. And 90% of their diet was from root vegetables, which grow rain, hail, or shine, and in the ground it's cooler than above the ground. So yeah, there are solutions. Definitely, the climate will affect yields. I've heard figures that yields are going to decrease by about 20%. And also that the species won't be able to grow. So we're going to have to do a lot of research on that. 39 degrees, I haven't heard that number, but I do know that humans can't live much beyond that. We die. So not a matter of just turning the aircon on. If we can, we're lucky, but most people can't. So yes, there might be migration. There might be a bunch of Americans knocking at the Canada doorstep saying, "Let us in." I'm joking, but yes, it is going to be an issue. But as I say, an issue we can solve. We can tame the climate, reverse the climate. That's the beauty of methane. Methane is an incredible thing. It only lasts about 12 years or so in the atmosphere. Therefore, it is the only emission that we emit that if we reduce it by a dramatic amount, it will cause cooling. And the people who are arguing that we're overvaluing methane, and they argue that a certain level of constant emissions is okay, and that it's only if we emit more that we've got a problem. But they also model that if we emit less, hey, we're going to get cooling. So but strangely, the arguments are that if we slash methane, we can cool this planet. We can solve these things, and we can even find that carbon dioxide is a short-term pollutant if we can grow enough trees to soak that down. So, I believe, I think that we're going to hit dangerous climate change a lot quicker than we expect. But I also believe that we humans are slow but not stupid, and we will come against the real solutions, which are trees. So eat plants, plant trees.
Thank
you for that. So our next question, and if you can go ahead and mute yourself again, that'd be great. So our next question is coming from Stephen V. If you could state where you're from and ask your question. Oh, hold on a second here. There we go.
I'm from.
I'm sorry, Stephen, did you want to ask the question?
Yeah, I'm from Buffalo, New York, and just a very good presentation. A brief comment. I've made that transition to whole foods, plant-based, about more than a decade ago. But I must say that none of my friends are particularly interested. I mean, that's been my experience, even though I've had great results health-wise, and they're sort of in their late 60s having considerable health problems. Now, you made the transition 30 years ago. I did not find the transition easy, I must say. It was a real struggle. I'm wondering what your experience was and what, how effective you are in getting maybe your friends and family to eat healthier.
Yeah, your closest friends and family are your biggest critics normally. Well, okay. Well, so my personal experience is I had a health crisis and needed to change my diet radically, which I did. I've been vegetarian for 30 years and vegan for probably the last 20 years. I've never worried about getting certain nutrients. I've never worried about B12. I've never worried about, getting enough protein. I mean, I'm 70 and I run once or twice a week. It's a 5K run. It's not long. I play golf. I walk around. I'm fitter and healthier than I've probably ever been in my life. I had a health crisis when I was in my 30s. So you can do it, and there is information out there, of course. But how do you convince friends and family? What I found is that the greatest people won't do what you tell them to do, but they will copy your example, or they will talk about your example to their friends, who will then copy that example. We have no idea how powerful it is just by being vegan. One individual being vegan is extremely powerful. A lot of people will hear about that, and it will become normalized. And the science says that when we get to, we've got to bump off the older generation, but when we get to the point where the younger generations do turn en masse, if 25% of the population turn to vegan or close to it, that is a tipping point. And then it will be, rather than, oh, that's weird being not eating animal products, to, oh, you still eat meat? You know, that's the way it'll be. Yeah. So personally, don't worry about other people. Don't try to change the world. Just do yourself, and that's the most powerful thing you can do. Certainly, listen to this sort of, as you're doing, listen to these presentations, find out the facts, repeat the facts to people when you get the chance. Don't bully them with it, but just talk about it. That's how we change. People are being bombarded with meat advertising every day, lots of it. So it's the talk, it's the influence that you have when you don't think you're having influence. That counts. That really counts. Yeah. So does that answer your question?
Actually, they dropped down. Yeah, I think that addressed their question. So our next question is coming from Stacy A. Please state where you're from and ask your question, Stacy.
Hi, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area in California. Thank you, Jared. This is far and away the most densely packed and useful talk I've heard so far. This was absolute brilliance. And you did kind of answer one of my questions with the previous questioner, so I'm not going to go into that. But I did have another. You were talking about encouraging people to buy only deforestation-free beef, and how even that change alone would have a massive effect. How do we know that deforestation-free beef isn't going to be another tool of greenwashing, same way that maybe buying carbon offsets for air travel is greenwashing?
Yeah, no, you're dead right. I read that study with a bit of skepticism because how can you tell? I mean, JBS, it's their business model to keep it all muddy. So they're not going to clarify things because a few consumers ask for it, but it's that sort of thing. It's the pressure from the funding bodies. It's influencing the superannuation funds and the finance funds that fund JBS, and it's to the tunes of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions, and others. That's where we can bring pressure to bear on industries. Shareholders can bring pressure to bear. And that's been done, and it's happening for climate, and it's happening to great effect. And now Europe have instituted the New Deal, where none of the products that are imported into Europe are to be connected with deforestation. So this is powerful. That's only just happened, but it's going to change whole supply chains. It means that JBS need to clean up their act, and they need to show that they're not sourcing beef from people who are still doing deforestation, even though they're driving it, of course. But Europe has changed their mind. They're saying, no, we're not going to take any deforestation beef anymore. So that and any other product, by the way, palm oil, you name it. So that's gonna mean a big change to all the suppliers of all products that come from the land to Europe. So, if other nations follow that, and Europe's pretty got a lot of purchasing power, if other nations follow that, you might find the world will change through that mechanism alone.
To Stacy's point, though, when it comes to finding deforestation-free animal products, how do we ensure we're when someone's promoting it, that we're not walking into something like the idea of like free range and cage-free eggs, when they're listed as free range and cage-free, and people feel so wonderful about their choices, only to find out that free range can mean they were let outside for a minute a day, or cage free means they're not in a cage anymore, but there's 10,000 chickens on top of each other with their beaks cut off and their claw, and their talons cut off, and they're jammed in. So it's not really an improvement in the quality of life. It's really just a change in the suffering, or the change in the way they present it to the world, but the impact is still the same. So how do we, is there a way, or are there brands that have been guaranteed are actually deforestation free? Is there a way to know that you're actually making a meaningful choice to move things in the right direction?
Yeah, no, sorry, I should have answered that. That's the reason why I laughed at that study a bit, because you can't tell, even if they've got a label on the packet, deforestation free. I would be highly skeptical of that, unless there was some, government mandated system of scrutiny of that. And this is where industry's been so good at the greenwash. For example, regenerative grazing, or regenerative ranching has been held up as this wonderful thing, even though it's got no basis in fact. But it's great marketing, so it's going to be used again and again and again. A good example is the Australian Meat and Livestock Australia, MLA. They about 5 years ago, they implemented this new program, carbon neutral by 2030 for red meat, okay, for beef, which did my head in, because I know how much deforestation is continuing for beef. So what's happened is that last year there was a study came out that looked at the number of cattle in Australia, and it's always been about the same number of cattle as the people. So there's been about high 20 million cattle, but this study found that there's another 50%. So they've undercounted the cattle in Australia by it's 50% more than what they've counted. So MLA are looking at this and thinking, well, if there's 50% more cattle, how on earth are we going to say there's less methane? Because they've got to argue that for the carbon neutral beef, and they can't. So what they've done is they've quietly shelved their carbon neutral by 2030 claims. That's if held to account, and in Australia it's pretty good. There's a pretty good system of holding industry to account. So we need those systems. This is why I think the European system is going to be so powerful, because the whole supply chain will have to be scrutinized. So I think that's the sort of answer. But in a country where you have advertising that can say what they please and little government oversight, it's buyer beware. So yeah, if I saw a label that said deforestation-free beef, I'd be very surprised for a start, and I wouldn't believe it.
Thank you. So we've got about 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask a question, and then just also, if you have any concluding comments that you'd like to leave people with in the next 3 minutes. So how do you address criticisms from animal agriculture regarding the environmental impact of meat production portrayed in the film and in your work? And then any final thoughts?
Yeah, look, there hasn't been that much criticism. Normally there is, but what we've strived for with Eating Our Way to Extinction is that everything we say in that documentary is backed up by the science. It's all fact-based. It's not someone's observation. So that's how we've kept it to the science. That was my job. So that's how we got it there. Just one thing I might mention is in the comments is saying that 90% of soybeans are GM. That's true. And that's the 90% that's fed to animals. The soybeans that's fed to humans is mostly organic, at least in Australia, and most probably Europe, and probably North America as well. But it's less than 10% of soybean global production that goes to humans. Most of it goes to animals, and there are no laws that, except in Europe now, that say no GM animal feed. So that's that answer. Sorry, there's one other question. Can you repeat that? What else?
Well, I was talking about criticism by the agricultural industry, and then just sort of final wrap up. We've got 1 minute, so if there's any message that you'd like to leave the audience with before you conclude.
Yeah, well, I guess the main thing is that our situation is a lot more dire than we realise. That global warming is accelerating now as the skies clear. That deforestation is still rampant. All of these things are contributing to tipping points. The Amazon looks like it may have reached a tipping point. The lungs of the planet. However, this is a good news story, and it all comes down to land use. If we can change enough land back to forest the way it used to be, we can solve most of the problems that the environment faces today. We could have a healthy wildlife. We could stop biodiversity loss in its tracks. We could stop climate change in its tracks. We could stop deforestation. We will grow healthier. There's so many things that this fixes, so many things. It's profound. And all it takes is eat plants, plant trees. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for all of the information that you shared with us today. So if we could please unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Amazing.
Super interesting.